Before they ever fled, Palermo Molly's grandmother taught her a grim lesson about white linen tablecloths, once dried marinara sauce, and carnage carry the exact same scent. Tonight, standing in the corner of a Michelin-starred dining room, with her hands trembling against a silver serving tray, that scent finds her again. It isn't the sauce. They say you can never outrun your roots, and she is about to prove them right, unleashing 5 forbidden words she swore she'd never speak again. Porcelain plates clattered in the kitchen, a sharp, chaotic symphony that usually kept her grounded. Tonight, the noise barely registered over the roaring in her ears. Molly shifted her weight from her left foot to her right, wincing as the blister on her heel ground against the cheap leather of her regulation uniform shoes. 4 years she had worked at Laura, blending into the flocked wallpaper and the heavy mahogany wainscoting. She was a ghost who brought bread baskets and cleared crumb-strewn plates. She liked being invisible. Ghosts didn't get fired. Ghosts didn't get noticed by men who left $50 bills under their espresso cups, men whose eyes looked like flat, black river stones. Matteo Santoro was a regular. He commanded the center booth every Thursday night, flanked by men who wore suits tailored to hide the bulk of shoulder holsters. Matteo didn't look like a mobster from the movies. He didn't chew on cigars or wear fedoras. He wore charcoal brioni, drank sparkling water with a single twist of lemon, and spoke in a voice so quiet you had to lean in to hear him. Molly never leaned in. She kept her distance. But she noticed the details. She couldn't help it. She noticed how his cuticles were always meticulously manicured, yet the knuckles beneath them carried faint yellowish-purple bruises fading into the olive skin. She noticed the metallic tang of ozone and cold sweat that lingered in his wake, cutting right through the restaurant's ambient aroma of truffle oil and roasted garlic. Tonight was different. The restaurant had been shut down to the public. Yanni, our maitre d', had been sweating through his silk undershirt since 3 o'clock. The air conditioning was cranked so high her forearms were covered in goosebumps, but the kitchen staff was still wiping their brows with grease-stained towels. Molly. Gianni hissed his fingers, digging into her bicep. His breath smelled of stale coffee and pure panic. Booth 1, water glasses. Now. And for the love of God, don't look at anyone in the eye. She nodded, swallowing the dry lump in her throat. She grabbed the heavy crystal pitcher, the condensation slick against her palms. Matteo was already seated, but his usual relaxed posture was gone. He sat rigidly tracing the rim of an empty wine glass with one finger. The squeak of skin on crystal was the only sound in the room. His men weren't sitting. They stood at the perimeter, hands clasped loosely in front of them, eyes darting towards the heavy velvet curtains that separated the private dining area from the vestibule. Molly approached the table, keeping her gaze locked on the white linen tablecloth. It was freshly pressed, smelling sharply of industrial bleach and hot iron. She poured the water. Clink. The ice hit the glass. Matteo's hand shot out his fingers, wrapping around her wrist. His grip wasn't bruising, but it was absolute. It felt like being caught in a velvet-lined vice. "Leave the pitcher," he said. His voice was rougher than usual, frayed at the edges. She didn't look up. "Yes, sir." He let go. Her pulse hammered against the skin where his fingers had just been. She backed away, pressing her spine against the cool plaster of the wall near the service station. She wanted to take her apron off, walk out the back door by the dumpsters, and take the subway home. She wanted to lock her deadbolt and watch cheap infomercials until she fell asleep. Then the front doors opened. The heavy brass hinges groaned. The draft from the street blew in, carrying the scent of rain on concrete and the sharp chemical burn of car exhaust. Matteo stood up. The men along the walls stiffened. The dawn had arrived. Footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. Not the brisk, urgent steps of a busy man, but the slow, deliberate drag and click of someone who owned the floor, the building, and everyone breathing inside it. Vincenzo Santoro walked into the dining room. He was smaller than she expected. Age had hollowed out his cheeks and hunched his shoulders, pulling his frame inward like a dying star collapsing on itself. He leaned heavily on a silver-tipped walking stick. But the air in the room didn't care that he was old. The oxygen seemed to thin out the moment he crossed the threshold. He wore a double-breasted suit that belonged in the 1980s, heavy wool that smelled intensely of stale cigar smoke, bitter espresso, and something faintly medicinal like rubbing alcohol and old leather. Matteo stepped forward. He didn't offer a hand. He bowed his head just a fraction. "Papa," Vincenzo stopped. He didn't look at his son. He looked at the ceiling, at the crystal chandelier, at the spotless linen tables. His upper lip curled, exposing a row of teeth that were more grey than white. "You bring me here." Vincenzo's voice was a rusted blade scraping against stone. His English was heavily accented, thick and slow. "To a place that cooks pasta for people who put ketchup on their meat." Matteo's jaw tightened. Molly could see the muscle ticking beneath his ear. "It's the best room in the city, Papa. It's secure." "Secure." Vincenzo spat the word like a bad olive pit. He waved his cane, gesturing vaguely at the room. "It has no soul. It has no blood. It is an American hospital pretending to be a kitchen." He moved toward the table, every step radiating a cold, exhausted anger. Matteo pulled out a chair for him. Vincenzo ignored it, choosing the chair opposite, forcing Matteo to adjust. It was a petty, calculated move, a reminder of who was prey and who was predator. From her corner, Molly watched the waiters freeze. Marco, a veteran server who had worked at Laura for 10 years, was holding the first bottle of wine, a 1996 Barolo. His hands were shaking so badly the foil capsule rattled against the corkscrew. Gianni practically shoved Marco out of the way, snatching the bottle, but Gianni was sweating too much. He couldn't get a grip on the cork. Vincenzo drummed his fingers on the table. The sound was deafening. Tap, tap, tap. Are we waiting for the grapes to grow, or are we going to drink? Vincenzo asked the room. He didn't look at Gianni. He looked right through him. Gianni fumbled the cork, half torn. He looked at Molly. His eyes were wide, pleading. "Help me." She hated him in that moment. She hated him for putting her in the line of fire, but survival in a restaurant is an instinct. You see a falling plate, you catch it. You see a dying table, you rescue it. Molly stepped away from the wall. She took the bottle from Gianni's trembling hands. The glass was cool. The label was textured under her thumb. She pulled the corkscrew out, reset the hinge, and extracted the torn cork with a smooth, silent pull. She didn't think. She just moved. She walked to the table, holding the bottle with the label facing the men. Vincenzo didn't look at her. He was staring at Matteo, his eyes filled with a disgust so profound it made her stomach turn. "You have gone soft, Matteo," Vincenzo murmured, leaning back. "You sit in these glass towers. You wear these silk ties. You think this makes you a king. It makes you a target. You let the Irish take the docks. You let the Russians breathe our air." Matteo kept his voice level, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his napkin. "The docks are a liability. We diversified. The tech shipping routes yield triple the revenue with zero blood on the streets. Times change. Times change." Vincenzo mocked, shaking his head slowly. "Men do not change. Blood does not change." Molly poured the wine into Vincenzo's glass. The liquid was dark, thick, the color of crushed garnets. It smelled of dark cherries, damp earth, and old wood. Vincenzo suddenly slammed his hand flat on the table. The crystal water pitcher rattled. Molly flinched, pulling the bottle back just in time to stop a drop of wine from hitting the pristine cloth. "You disgrace the name," Vincenzo hissed, leaning forward. He was no longer speaking English. He switched to a dialect. Not standard Italian. Not the polished lyrical language they teach on language apps. It was a harsh, guttural dialect from the deepest, poorest corners of Sicily. The kind of dialect that sounded like a fist fight. It was the language of Molly's grandfather. The language her nonna used when she was scrubbing blood out of Molly's father's shirts before the police arrived. Palermitano, broad, thick, and unforgiving. Si nu figlio di nudo. Vincenzo sneered at Matteo. You are the son of nobody. Matteo's eyes darkened, a flash of pure, unadulterated hatred passing over his face before he masked it with cold indifference. He understood the words clearly, but he didn't respond in kind. He just sat there, taking the verbal beating, his silence a testament to his forced restraint. Vincenzo wasn't finished. He looked down at the glass of Barolo Molly had just poured. He picked it up, swirled it once, and smelled it. He wrinkled his nose. He spoke again, still in that thick, ragged dialect, assuming no one in this sanitized American room could possibly understand him. He muttered it to himself, a bitter curse aimed at the world. Fanno vivere lacitu ai cani e mi chiamano patroni, camerieri che non sanno manco ci a usali. They feed vinegar to dogs and call me boss. Waiters who don't even know what salt is. He was going to send the wine back. He was going to upend the table. She could feel the violence coiling in his muscles, preparing to strike outwards, just to make his son bleed a little more. Something inside Molly snapped. It wasn't bravery. She was not a brave person. She was a survivor. She paid her bills on time, and she looked both ways before crossing the street, and she never ever talked back. But standing there smelling the stale cigar smoke and the damp earth of the wine, listening to this cruel, dying man insult his son just to feel powerful, a ghost woke up in her chest. It was her nonna's ghost, the woman who taught her how to make a sauce that could feed 10 people out of 3 tomatoes, the woman who told her that a man who complains about his wine is a man who cannot control his own house. Molly held the bottle by her side. The glass was warming against her palm. Without thinking, without stopping to calculate the catastrophic risk to her job, her safety, or her life, she looked directly into Don Vincenzo Santoro's flat black eyes. She opened her mouth, and the dialect scraped out of her throat, rusty but perfectly pitched. The accent was heavy, dragging on the vowels exactly the way it did in the alleyways of Ballarò. Uvinu e bonu don, lacitu e sulu natovucca. The wine is good, Don. The vinegar is only in your mouth. Silence. It didn't fall over the room. It crashed down like a collapsed ceiling. The ambient hum of the air conditioner suddenly sounded like a jet engine. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the lobby echoed like gunshots. At the perimeter of the room, 3 of Matteo's men reached into their jackets. The sound of fabric rustling against leather holsters was loud, sharp, and terrifying. Her heart stopped beating. She felt the blood drain from her face, pooling somewhere in her aching feet. What had she done? Vincenzo froze, his hand still holding the stem of the wineglass suspended in mid-air. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he turned his head to look at her. For the first time all evening, he really saw her. He saw the cheap uniform, the hair pulled back in a severe bun, the exhaustion bruised beneath her eyes. But his gaze wasn't dismissive anymore. It was sharp, piercing, dissecting. Matteo had frozen too. His head whipped toward her, his composure completely shattered. His lips were parted slightly in shock, his dark eyes wide, staring at her, as if a chair had just grown wings and spoken. Molly couldn't move. Her fingers were locked in a death grip around the neck of the Barolo bottle. If she let go, it would shatter on the floor, and she was sure someone would shoot her for the noise alone. Vincenzo lowered the glass. He placed it softly onto the white linen. He leaned forward, resting both hands on the silver head of his cane. The smell of rubbing alcohol and old leather intensified. "What did you say?" Vincenzo asked. He spoke in English this time, but his voice was a dangerous, quiet whisper. A snake sliding through dry grass. Her throat was parched. She swallowed hard, the muscles in her neck clicking. She wanted to lie. She wanted to say she had misspoken, that she was just reciting a phrase she heard in a movie. But looking into Vincenzo's eyes, she knew a lie would insult him more than the truth. She kept her voice low, stripping away the customer service sweetness she had worn for 4 years. She let her voice drop to its natural, tired register. "I said the wine is good," she repeated, maintaining eye contact, even though every instinct screamed at her to look at the floor. "The bitterness is yours." One of the bodyguards stepped forward, a massive wall of muscle in a cheap suit, his hand fully inside his jacket. "Boss," Vincenzo held up a single crooked finger. The bodyguard stopped dead in his tracks. Vincenzo kept his eyes on her. The wrinkles around his mouth deepened. The heavy silence stretched, pulling tighter and tighter until she thought her ribs would crack under the pressure. She waited for the explosion. She waited for him to demand Gianni fire her, or worse, have one of the men drag her out back by her hair. Instead, a strange guttural sound began to build in Vincenzo's chest. It sounded like stones grinding together. It took her a full 3 seconds to realize he was laughing. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was a dry, hacking bark that shook his fragile shoulders. "Palermo," Vincenzo said, still chuckling darkly, coughing slightly into his fist. He tapped a finger against the table. "You have the dirt of Palermo in your throat, little bird. You hide it well under this stupid American apron." Molly didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just stood there, the adrenaline making her fingertips buzz. Matteo was watching her now. The shock had left his face replaced by something much more dangerous. Curiosity. His dark eyes tracked from the rigid line of her shoulders to her white-knuckled grip on the wine bottle, then up to her face. The flat black river stones were suddenly catching the light. "Pour the wine, Palermo," Vincenzo commanded, leaning back into his chair, a bizarre, twisted smirk resting on his grey face. "Let us see if you pour it as bravely as you speak." Her hands shook, but she stepped forward. She topped off his glass, then moved to Matteo. As she leaned in the scent of ozone and crisp linen wrapped around her, Matteo didn't look at his father. He looked up at her, his gaze burning into the side of her face. When she pulled the bottle back, Matteo leaned in, his voice so quiet only she could hear it over the sound of his father drinking. "No one speaks to him like that." Matteo murmured, his breath brushing against her wrist. "Who are you?" She didn't answer him. She stepped back, clutching the tray to her chest like a shield, the 5 words she had spoken still hanging in the air, like smoke, permanently altering the oxygen in the room. She was a ghost, no longer. And in this world, being seen was the most dangerous thing she could possibly be. Retreating through the swinging kitchen doors felt like walking through water. Her knees locked with every step. The kitchen was a sensory assault, shouting line, cooks the hiss of garlic hitting hot oil, the clatter of industrial dishwashers, but it all sounded muted, like she was listening to it underwater. Gianni didn't yell. That was how she knew she was truly doomed. He just stood by the stainless steel prep station, wiping his forehead with a damp rag, staring at her as if she were a ghost that had just manifested to predict his death. "I need 5 minutes," she croaked. Her voice didn't sound like her own. Gianni didn't argue. He just waved a trembling hand toward the back exit. She pushed through the heavy metal fire door and stumbled into the alley. The cold night air slapped her across the face, smelling of rotting cabbage from the dumpster's wet asphalt and the sharp bite of impending rain. She leaned heavily against the brick wall, the rough texture snagging her cheap uniform blouse. She dug into her apron pocket with numb fingers, pulling out a crushed pack of Marlboros and a plastic lighter. It took 3 tries to get the flame to hold steady enough to light the cigarette. She dragged the cheap, harsh smoke into her lungs, closing her eyes and letting the burn ground her. Stupid. Arrogant. Stupid. She hit the back of her head against the brick. What was she trying to prove her nonna was dead? The Palermo streets she remembered were just faded Polaroids in a shoebox under her bed. She was a waitress in a city that didn't care if she lived or died, and she had just humiliated a Mafia don in front of his crew. I always thought people who smoked in alleys were either hiding from a lover or a debt collector. The voice was smooth, pitched low, and completely devoid of the gravelly exhaustion of Vincenzo's. Her eyes flew open. Matteo Santoro was standing near the fire door. The dull, flickering yellow light of the security bulb above him cast long, sharp shadows across the angles of his face. He looked entirely out of place among the grease traps and stacked milk crates wrapped in charcoal wool that probably cost more than her annual rent. She didn't speak. She just took another drag of her cigarette, her hand trembling slightly, the cherry glowing orange in the gloom. He took a step forward. The soles of his leather shoes made no sound on the wet pavement. He stopped 3 feet away, just close enough for his personal space to brush against hers. The smell of his cologne bergamot cedar and something distinctly metallic like cold iron cut right through the stench of the alley. "You didn't answer my question in there," Matteo said, his hands resting easily in his trouser pockets. He wasn't glaring. He was studying her, mapping the exhaustion around her eyes and the tight defensive set of her jaw. "I'm a waitress," she said. Her voice was raspy from the smoke. "And I think my break is over. Gianni won't mind if you take another minute." Matteo tilted his head. "In fact, I think Gianni is currently drafting his own will in the walk-in freezer." A bitter, humorless laugh pushed past her lips. "I'll mail him my apologies." Matteo didn't smile. His dark eyes flicked down to the cigarette pinched between her fingers, then back to her face. "My father is a difficult man. He builds his power by making the people around him feel small. You didn't shrink. I was stupid." She corrected him, looking away. She focused on a puddle of oily water near his left shoe. "It was a lapse in judgment. It won't happen again." "No, it wasn't a lapse." Matteo pulled one hand from his pocket and reached out. She flinched her shoulders, jumping toward her ears. He froze. His hand hovered in the space between them for a fraction of a second before he smoothly redirected it, tapping his own chest. "You didn't react out of fear. You reacted out of pride. Palermitano pride. It's a very specific, very stubborn kind of cancer. I don't know what you're talking about." She dropped the cigarette and crushed it under the heel of her cheap shoe, grinding the toe into the wet pavement. "You know exactly what I'm talking about." His voice dropped an octave, brushing against her nerves like sandpaper. "He called me a nobody. He called my men dogs, and you defended the wine. Why?" She looked up at him. The flat black river stones of his eyes weren't flat anymore. There was a current underneath them. Something dangerous and deeply obsessive. He wasn't used to puzzles. He was used to obedience. "I didn't defend the wine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, the truth slipping out before her common sense could gag her. "I defended the silence. I was tired of listening to a cruel man tear down his own house." Matteo stared at her. The muscle in his jaw ticked. For a long moment the only sound was the distant wail of a police siren bleeding through the city blocks. Slowly he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Her breath hitched, but he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a sleek silver business card case. He extracted a plain white card with nothing but a phone number embossed in black ink. He held it out. "I don't want this," she said, her hands flat against her sides. "Take it anyway." It wasn't a request. The velvet vice was back in his tone. She hesitated, then reached out. As her fingers pinched the edge of the card, his thumb brushed against her knuckle. His skin was rougher than it looked, calloused and hot. A jolt of electricity snapped up her forearm, settling heavy and warm in the pit of her stomach. "Go back inside, Molly," Matteo said quietly. He knew her name. Of course he knew her name. He turned and walked back towards the street, his silhouette melting into the damp shadows of the alleyway long before his footsteps faded. She stood alone in the cold, holding a piece of cardstock that felt heavier than a loaded gun. Tuesday arrived with the kind of creeping dread that settles in your bones and makes your joints ache. She spent 3 days waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for Gianni to fire her, waiting for the shadow of a man in a cheap suit to follow her onto the subway. None of it happened. When she clocked in at Laura, Gianni didn't look at her. He assigned her to the back section, the Siberia of the restaurant, where they seated tourists who walked in without reservations and couples fighting too quietly to cause a scene. She was relieved. She wanted to fade back into the wallpaper. By 8 o'clock, her feet were throbbing, the blister on her heel having ruptured and reformed into a hard, angry callus. She was wiping down a table, scraping up dried breadcrumbs with the edge of a silver crumber, when the air in the room changed. You don't just see power, you feel the barometric pressure drop. She didn't look up, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Conversations at the nearby tables faltered, dropping a few decibels. "Molly!" Gianni's voice was a tight, terrified squeak behind her left shoulder. She paused, the metal crummer hovering over a linen napkin. She straightened up, turning slowly. Matteo was standing in the center of the dining room. He wasn't flanked by a dozen men this time, just 2 standing discreetly near the coat check. Matteo was looking directly at her, ignoring the maitre d' completely. "Mr. Santoro requests booth 1. Gianni whispered frantically, pushing her gently by the elbow. "And he requested you." Her stomach plummeted. "Gianni, please. Give him to Marco. Give him to anyone." "He asked for you." Gianni hissed, his panic morphing into anger. "Do you want to explain to him why you refuse go? Now!" She wiped her damp palms on her apron, picked up a fresh pitcher of water, and walked towards the front of the house. Every step felt like walking to the gallows. Matteo was already seated. He was wearing a dark navy suit today, the fabric absorbing the dim amber light of the restaurant. He was reading the menu, though she knew he already had it memorized. "Good evening," she said, her voice flat and mechanical. She focused on the water glass. Clink, clink, ice cubes tumbled in. "You look tired, Molly," Matteo observed without looking up from the menu. "It's a busy night, sir." He closed the menu and placed it softly on the table. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the edge. The bruised knuckles were gone, replaced by smooth, unblemished skin. He looked like a CEO. He smelled like a hunter. "How is the heel?" he asked. She froze. The water pitcher tipped slightly, a drop of condensation landing on the tablecloth. She stared at the dark spot as it bloomed on the white fabric. "Excuse me, you favor your right foot. You've been doing it since I started coming here 3 months ago. You have a blister on your left heel that isn't healing because you buy shoes with plastic soles instead of leather." Matteo stated this clinically, as if reading from a spreadsheet. Her chest tightened. It was one thing to be noticed speaking out of turn. It was another entirely to realize a man like Matteo Santoro had been watching her closely enough to map her limp. "My shoes are fine," she lied, stepping back. "Would you like to hear the specials? I want the veal," he said, holding her gaze. "And I want to know why Molly Russo, granddaughter of Donato Russo, is pouring water for minimum wage when her grandfather ran the largest underground betting syndicate in Palermo before the Corleonesi wiped out his crew in 1989. The blood vanished from her head. The room tilted violently. The ambient noise of clinking silverware and soft jazz faded into a high-pitched ringing. She slammed the water pitcher onto the table. It was louder than she intended. Several heads turned. She didn't care. "Keep your voice down," she hissed, leaning over the table, her hands bracing against the edge. The fear was entirely gone, vaporized by a sudden blinding spike of panic and rage. "Where did you get that name?" Matteo didn't flinch at her anger. If anything, he looked satisfied. He leaned back, giving her space, observing the fire he had just ignited. "I make it my business to know who speaks to my father in my house," Matteo said softly. "It took my guys 2 days to trace your mother's maiden name. You vanished quietly. A smart move considering the bounty that was likely on your grandfather's head." "My grandfather was a baker," she lied, her voice shaking. "You have the wrong person. Your grandfather was a ghost maker." Matteo corrected his voice, dropping into a deadly quiet register. "And he taught you how to hide. You hide very well, Molly. The severe hair, the clothes that don't fit, the absolute refusal to make eye contact with anyone who has money. You engineered yourself to be invisible, and yet here you are, shining a spotlight on me." She spat, her fingers curling into tight fists against the tablecloth. "What do you want? Do you want to kill me for a 30-year-old grudge? Get in line!" Matteo's eyes darkened. The calm facade slipped just a fraction, revealing something violently possessive underneath. He reached across the table. She tried to pull back, but he was faster. His hand clamped over her wrist, right over her pulse point. His thumb pressed against the frantically beating vein. "I don't want to kill you, Molly," he said, his voice rough. "If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't have made it to the alley on Thursday. I want to know why a woman with Russo blood in her veins is burying herself alive in this city." "Because I want to live," she whispered, yanking her arm back. He let go easily, leaving her skin burning where he touched it. "That's it. That's the grand mystery. I want to pay my rent, buy cheap shoes, and die of old age. Leave me alone." She grabbed the menu and turned on her heel, ignoring the searing pain in her blister as she stalked back to the kitchen. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes on her spine, a heavy physical weight that made her lungs ache. Sleep became a concept rather than a reality. Over the next 2 weeks, the paranoia became her shadow. Every time a dark sedan slowed down near her apartment building, her heart hammered against her ribs. Every time a man in a tailored suit walked into the bodega where she bought her morning coffee, she memorized the exits. But the strange part, the deeply sick and contradictory part of her brain, hated the silence. She hated the days Matteo didn't show up at the restaurant. It was a Tuesday night, raining so hard the water was coming down in sheets, blurring the streetlights into smeared yellow streaks. Laura was nearly empty. We were closing early. Gianni had sent the busboys home. She was alone in the main dining room, wiping down the mahogany wainscoting, smelling the sharp chemical lemon scent of wood polish. The repetitive motion usually calmed her, but tonight her skin felt too tight for her bones. The front door clicked. They had locked it at 10. It was 10:30. She froze the rag clutched in her hand. She listened. The heavy, measured footsteps weren't Gianni's frantic pacing, and they weren't the heavy, dragged steps of Vincenzo. They were smooth, calculated. Matteo walked out of the vestibule. He was alone. His coat was damp across the shoulders, making the dark fabric look pitch black. He didn't say a word. He just walked toward her, unbuttoning his overcoat and draping it over the back of a chair. "We're closed," she said, her voice defensive, backing up until her hips hit the edge of a heavy oak serving station. "I know," Matteo said. He kept walking until he was standing a foot away from her. The smell of the rain on him mixed with the lemon polish and the faint scent of expensive bourbon. He looked exhausted. Deep shadows bruised the skin under his eyes, and the knot of his tie was pulled loose, a small, sloppy detail that seemed completely alien on him. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her fingers gripping the edge of the wood behind her. "Gianni will be back from the office in a minute." "Gianni went home 20 minutes ago," Matteo said quietly. I told him you could lock up. Her throat clicked as she swallowed. You bought my boss. I bought the building. Matteo corrected softly, looking down at her. Yesterday. The rag slipped from her fingers, landing silently on the carpet. You bought a Michelin-starred restaurant just to intimidate a waitress. I bought it because it's a good investment, and because the maitre d' was working you to the bone, and it irritated me. He didn't smile. He said it with the terrifying sincerity of a man who moved mountains to adjust the breeze. You are insane. She breathed, pushing off the counter to step around him. He didn't grab her arm this time. He just shifted his weight, blocking her path. He was much taller than her, up close, a solid wall of muscle and wool. My father is organizing a sit-down. Matteo said, his voice dropping into that quiet, confidential tone that always made her chest hurt. Next Friday, in the private room downstairs, he invited the heads of 3 families. It's supposed to be a peace summit. Why are you telling me this? She looked up at him, her brow furrowed. I don't care about your Mafia politics. Because he demanded you serve the table, Matteo said. The air left her lungs. No, absolutely not. He doesn't forget Molly. You insulted him in a language he considers holy. He wants to see you break. He wants to watch you pour wine and clear plates while he discusses carving up the city just to prove to you that your Russo blood means nothing. That you are just the help. I am just the help. She threw her hands up in frustration. I don't care about pride, I care about survival. Tell him I quit. Tell him I died. If you run, he will find you. Matteo's voice was bleak, a heavy truth anchoring her to the floor. You know how these men work. You know how the old blood thinks. To him, an insult left unpunished is a weakness. He won't let you just walk away. She stared at him, the reality settling over her like a suffocating blanket. The panic bubbled up raw and bitter. So what I serve him, I let him humiliate me for 4 hours and hope he tips me a 20 and lets me live. No! Matteo stepped closer. The heat radiating off him cut through the chill of the empty restaurant. You serve the table, and you listen. You understand the dialect. The old men, they speak in Palermitano when they don't want the younger soldiers to know the specifics. They think you are a beaten dog. They won't guard their tongues around you. She understood. The realization hit her like a physical blow. You want me to spy on your own father? Matteo looked down, his jaw tightening. The internal war playing out behind his eyes was violent and silent. My father wants to start a war that will burn this city to the ground. He thinks blood is the only currency that matters. He is going to betray the truce next Friday. I need to know exactly how he plans to do it. And if he catches me listening, she whispered, her voice trembling. If he figures out I'm feeding you information, he will skin me alive. Matteo lifted his hand. He hesitated, then pressed his palm flat against her cheek. His hand was huge, warm, and slightly rough. The touch was so unexpected, so startlingly gentle, that her eyes fluttered shut for a fraction of a second before she forced them open. I won't let him touch you! Matteo swore, his voice fierce, the flat river stones in his eyes catching fire. I swear it on my life, Molly. I will burn the room down myself before I let him lay a hand on you. She stared into his eyes, looking for a lie. Looking for the sociopathic manipulation she knew men like him used as easily as breathing. But all she saw was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, asking her to jump with him. The rational part of her brain screamed at her to run to the police, to pack her bags and move to the Midwest. But the ghost in her chest, the Russo blood that had been lying dormant for a decade, woke up and stretched. It was a sick, twisted thrill. The danger smelled like rain and bourbon, and it felt like the warm palm pressing against her cheek. One night, she whispered, pulling her face away from his hand, though the ghost of his touch remained burning her skin. One night, and then you let me disappear. Matteo's hand fell to his side. He nodded slowly, a dark, solemn promise. "One night," he agreed. But as he turned to walk out into the rain, leaving her alone in the silent, polished restaurant, she knew they were both lying. You don't wake up a ghost and expect it to go back to sleep. And you don't make a deal with the devil expecting him to open the door when you want to leave. Friday tasted like pennies and stale coffee. She spent the entire morning dry heaving over her bathroom sink, scrubbing her hands until the skin around her knuckles turned raw and pink. Gianni had given her the key to the private wine cellar downstairs. It was a room rarely used, a subterranean vault, built into the original foundations of the building, completely soundproofed by 3 feet of 19th century brick. Air down here didn't circulate. It sat heavy smelling of cork, dust, damp mortar, and the sickeningly sweet aroma of the roasted garlic veal resting on her serving cart. 4 men sat around a heavy oak table. Vincenzo occupied the head, his silver-tipped cane resting against his thigh. To his right sat Don Carmine, a man whose neck spilled over his shirt collar, sweating profusely, despite the cellar's chill. To Vincenzo's left was Leo, a younger underboss from the waterfront, who kept picking at his cuticles with a gold-plated pocket knife. And at the opposite end sat Matteo. Matteo looked like a man attending a funeral. He wore a solid black suit, his tie pulled tight, his posture rigidly straight. He didn't look at her when she entered. He didn't acknowledge her presence at all. She was just the help again. "More wine," Vincenzo commanded. He didn't bother using English. The dialect slithered out of his mouth, thick and ugly. Molly kept her eyes glued to the center of the oak table. She stepped forward, gripping the neck of a heavy Sangiovese bottle. Her hands were remarkably steady, a betrayal of the absolute panic vibrating in her chest. She poured the wine into Vincenzo's glass. He didn't move. She could feel the heat radiating off his wool suit, smell the harsh rubbing alcohol and stale cigar smoke clinging to his skin. He wanted her to shake. He wanted her to spill a drop so he could punish her. She didn't give him the satisfaction. She twisted the bottle, catching the final drop, and stepped back. The summit began. For the first hour it was all English and standard Italian. Posturing. Carmine complained about the union bosses at the shipyards. Leo talked about the police crackdowns on the east side. Matteo offered solutions calm and measured, bringing up offshore accounts and shell corporations. He spoke like a businessman trying to rein in a pack of rabid dogs. Then Vincenzo tapped his cane against the floor. Once, twice. The table went dead silent. Vincenzo leaned forward, interlacing his gnarled fingers. When he spoke again, the polished veneer vanished. He slipped into the heavy guttural Palermitano dialect. "The accounts mean nothing if the streets don't fear us," Vincenzo rasped, glaring at his son. "You build paper castles, Matteo. The Russians laugh at us. The Irish spit on our territory. The Russians pay us 30% on all imported freight." Matteo replied, keeping his dialect flawless, though his accent carried a softer Americanized edge. "Fear doesn't pay the electric bill, Papa. Money does." Molly stood by the serving station, polishing a silver spoon she had already polished 5 times. She tuned out the English. She let the rhythm of the dialect wash over her, translating the rough syllables in her head, just like her nonna used to do when she read the letters from home. Carmine grunted, wiping his forehead with a linen napkin. "The old man is right. We look weak. We need to send a message. A loud one." "Tonight," Vincenzo said. The word dropped into the room like a lead weight. Her thumb slipped the edge of the spoon, digging sharply into her cuticle. She didn't wince. She kept polishing. Matteo's eyes narrowed. "Tonight, we agreed to a 3-month freeze on all street-level retaliation. If you hit the Russians tonight, you ignite a war we don't have the manpower to finish." Who said anything about the Russians? Vincenzo's smile was small, cruel, and entirely devoid of warmth. Molly stopped breathing. The air in the room suddenly felt dangerously thin. Vincenzo shifted his gaze from Matteo to Leo. The younger underboss stopped picking at his fingernails. He subtly adjusted his posture, sliding his right hand under the edge of the table. "A house divided cannot stand, my son." Vincenzo murmured the dialect rolling off his tongue like venom. "You want to be a businessman. You want to wear silk and look at spreadsheets. But you forgot how to be a butcher. A king must know how to butcher his own meat." He wasn't talking about a hit on a rival family. He was talking about a purge. Molly looked at Matteo. He was still staring at his father, his face an unreadable mask of cold stone. But his chest wasn't moving. He hadn't realized. He was calculating the external threats entirely blind to the rot sitting directly across from him. Leo Vincenzo said softly, "Take the garbage out." Time didn't slow down. That's a lie they tell in movies to make violence seem poetic. Time sped up, fracturing into a chaotic, terrifying blur of noise and movement. She saw Leo's shoulder dip. She saw the metallic glint of a suppressed pistol clearing the edge of the heavy oak table, aimed directly at Matteo's chest. Matteo was fast, but he was sitting down, boxed in by the heavy armchair. He started to reach for his jacket, his eyes widening as the realization finally shattered his composed facade. He wasn't going to make it. She didn't think about her grandfather. She didn't think about her rent or her quiet life or the blister on her heel. She just reacted. Her hand closed around the neck of the heavy glass water pitcher resting on her serving station. It was full. It weighed at least 5 pounds. She didn't throw it at Leo. She threw it directly at the center of the table. The glass exploded against the oak wood with a concussive crash that sounded like a bomb going off in the confined space. Gallons of ice water and jagged shrapnel sprayed in every direction. Leo flinched instinctively, throwing his arm up to shield his face from the flying glass. His finger jerked on the trigger. Foot! The suppressed gunshot was violently loud, a sharp crack of displaced air. The bullet missed Matteo, tearing through the upholstered back of his chair, sending a plume of white stuffing into the air. Chaos erupted. Carmine scrambled backward, his chair tipping over, sending his massive frame crashing to the stone floor with a sickening thud. Vincenzo roared a sound of pure, unadulterated fury, trying to stand up, but his cane slipped on the puddle of ice water spreading across the floor. Matteo didn't freeze. The hesitation was gone. He lunged over the table, his hand wrapping around Leo's wrist. He twisted a brutal, bone-snapping motion. Leo screamed a high, wet sound, dropping the gun. It clattered against the wet stones. Molly backed into the brick wall, her chest heaving, her hands completely empty, and shaking so hard she couldn't feel her fingers. The smell of copper and hot brass filled the room, cutting through the garlic and the wine. Matteo slammed Leo's face into the oak table. The crunch of cartilage was loud enough to make her stomach turn. Leo went limp, sliding off the wood to crumple on the floor. Matteo stood up his chest, heaving his dark suit ruined by water and shattered glass. He reached into his waistband and pulled out his own weapon, pointing it directly at Vincenzo. The old man was still on his feet, leaning heavily on his cane, his chest rising and falling in ragged, uneven gasps. He didn't look afraid. He looked enraged. "You bring a gun to a sit-down." Matteo said, his voice entirely devoid of the dialect. He was speaking standard English now, cold, corporate, deadly. "You break the truce. You try to kill your own blood. You are a dinosaur, Papa, and the meteor just hit." Vincenzo spat on the floor. The saliva mixed with the water and glass. "You are weak. You let a waitress save your life." Matteo didn't look at her. He kept the gun leveled at his father's chest. "I let a Russo save my life. There's a difference. I am still the boss." Vincenzo snarled, his grip tightening on his cane. "You kill me, the families will rip you apart. You will not survive the week. They won't rip me apart because they won't know." Matteo said, his voice dropping into a deadly whisper. He gestured to Carmine, who was still cowering on the floor, breathing heavily. "Carmine is going to tell them that Leo made a play for the throne. Leo tried to take you out and I stopped him. But sadly I was too late to save you." Carmine scrambled to his knees, his face pale sweat dripping from his chin. Yes, Matteo. That's exactly what happened. Leo went crazy. The kid was a loose cannon." Vincenzo's eyes widened. For the first time, the absolute certainty of his power fractured. He looked at Carmine, then at Leo's unconscious body, and finally at Matteo. "You are no son of mine." Vincenzo whispered, his voice cracking. "No," Matteo agreed softly. "I'm the nobody you built." The gunshot wasn't suppressed. It was deafening. It rattled her teeth and sent a shockwave of pain through her eardrums. She squeezed her eyes shut, clapping her hands over her ears, letting out a sharp, involuntary gasp. When she opened her eyes, the smell of cordite was thick enough to choke on. A fine mist of plaster dust drifted down from the ceiling. Vincenzo was on the floor. He wasn't moving. Silence didn't just fall over the room, it suffocated it. Molly's stomach revolted, twisting violently. She clamped a hand over her mouth, swallowing down the sharp, acidic burn of bile and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Death in the movies is remarkably clean. A dramatic gasp, a slow slump, a tragic closing of the eyes. Reality is a grotesque assault on the senses. Vincenzo's body lay crumpled near the heavy oak table leg, his neck twisted at an angle the human spine simply shouldn't allow. Blood pooled beneath his head, thick and sluggish, creeping outward in irregular tendrils to mix with the shattered glass and the spilled ice water. It didn't look like a king's grand finale. It looked exactly like a butcher shop floor at closing time. Carmine was weeping. Actual pathetic tears cut tracks through the heavy grease and sweat on his face as he hauled his massive bulk up the stone stairs. His ragged, panicked breathing echoed off the vaulted brick ceiling. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind him. The deadbolt clicked. Matteo stood entirely still. He didn't look at his father's body. He stared straight ahead at the blank, mortar-streaked wall. His broad shoulders rose and fell in jerky, uneven increments, the only outward sign that he was anything other than a marble statue. Slowly, deliberately, his thumb moved over the side of his weapon. The mechanical click of the safety engaging cut through the high-pitched ringing in Molly's eardrums like a surgical blade. He holstered the gun. The movements were robotic, drilled into his muscle memory. Then he looked down at his own hands. They were smeared with Leo's blood, the crimson staining his knuckles and soaking into the pristine white cuffs of his tailored shirt. Molly was sliding. Her back scraped painfully against the rough brick wall until her hips finally hit the cold, wet stone floor. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest, wrapping her arms around her shins. Her cheap, plastic-soled shoes were soaked through with freezing water, the dampness seeping into her socks. She couldn't feel her toes. She couldn't feel her fingertips. She just felt the violent, uncontrollable, rhythmic shuddering of her own ribcage. The smell of the room was permanently burning itself into her olfactory nerves, cordite pulverized brick dust, raw copper, and the sharp acidic bite of spilled Sangiovese soaking into the grout. Matteo finally moved. He stepped over the wreckage of the chairs. His heavy leather shoes ground the broken crystal pitcher into fine, glittering powder against the stone. He stopped right in front of her, crouching down so his face was level with hers. Up close, his untouchable CEO facade was entirely obliterated. His silk tie was violently yanked to the side, ruined by water and plaster dust. A jagged, angry red scratch ran down the side of his neck where Leo's fingernails had frantically caught him during the struggle. He smelled like gunpowder, cold sweat, and the damp earth of the ruined wine. He reached into his pocket. Molly's muscles locked, instinctively preparing for another weapon, another explosion. But he pulled out a square of white linen. His hand hovered in the air between them, a few inches from her face. He was waiting for her to flinch. He was waiting for her to pull away in disgust. She didn't move. She couldn't have moved if the building was actively collapsing on top of them. He pressed the cloth to her cheek. A sharp, localized stinging flared across her skin. Molly hissed, her eyes watering automatically. "You're bleeding," he said. His voice was utterly destroyed. It was a raspy, hollow imitation of his usual smooth, commanding baritone. "So are you," she whispered back. Her jaw barely worked. The syllables felt clumsy and thick on her dry tongue, coated in gritty plaster dust. He pulled the cloth away, staring blankly at the small, bright crimson spot blooming on the white fabric. He folded it carefully, meticulously, hiding the blood in the center of the square, and shoved it back into his pocket. "I didn't ask for your help," Matteo said. His dark eyes finally shifted, locking onto hers. The flat black river stones were entirely shattered, revealing a frantic, chaotic current underneath. "You had a clear path to the door, Molly. When Leo drew his weapon, you were already at the serving station. You could have run. You should have run. Why the hell did you throw the glass?" It was the ultimate question. Why did she? Molly had spent 4 agonizing years perfecting the art of being invisible. She folded napkins with mechanical precision. She wiped crumbs without making eye contact. She kept her head down, her mouth shut, and her rent paid. Surviving meant walking away from burning buildings, not throwing oneself directly into the inferno. "I was tired," she breathed. The honest truth felt like coughing up glass. "I was so tired of being quiet. I was tired of watching men like him take up all the oxygen in a room and expect the rest of us to just hold our breath until we suffocate." She looked past his broad shoulder, forcing herself to look at the crumpled body of his father. "And I didn't want him to win. I didn't want you to die." Matteo's jaw clenched so hard she thought his teeth might crack. He reached out his large hands, wrapping around her upper arms. His grip was tight, bordering on bruising, fueled by raw desperation. He hauled her to her feet. Her legs immediately wobbled, the adrenaline crash turning her muscles to water. He caught her full weight, pulling her flush against his chest. The heavy, damp wool of his suit scratched against her cheek. She could hear his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, thunderous, terrified rhythm that perfectly matched her own. "You killed your quiet life," Matteo said, his mouth pressed hard against her temple. His breath was hot against her freezing skin. "There is no going back from this. Carmine saw you. He saw exactly what you did. By tomorrow morning the other families will know that the waitress in the cheap shoes chose a side and altered the hierarchy of the entire city. You can't put the apron back on." "I know," she said. The panic should have set in by now. The rational screaming part of her brain should have been kicking down the doors, demanding she flee to the airport. But it was completely silent. The ghost of her grandfather, the thick, unyielding Palermitano blood that had laid dormant for a decade, felt strangely settled, grounded, awake. "I won't let you disappear," Matteo vowed. It wasn't a romantic promise whispered in the dark. It was a threat, a dark, territorial, absolute claim. His hand slid up her neck to frame her face, his thumbs gently wiping away the smear of brick dust resting on her cheekbones. "You bled for me tonight. You claimed me in front of the old blood. You are mine now. I will burn down the other half of this city just to keep you breathing, but I will never, ever let you leave." Molly looked up into his eyes. There was absolutely no deception there. Just the raw, terrifying honesty of a man who had just severed his very last tie to humanity and found a brand new anchor in her. She reached up her shaking hands, slipping over his ruined tie to tightly grip the collar of his shirt. "If you ever try to put me in a cage," she whispered, her voice finally finding its footing, ringing steady and cold in the damp cellar, "I'll break the glass again." A fractured, breathless sound escaped him, half rough laugh, half exhausted sob. He leaned down, his mouth crashing into hers. There was no cinematic tenderness in it. It was a brutal collision of teeth and bruised lips, tasting intensely of salt, copper, and adrenaline. It was messy. It was desperate. Molly's hands tangled violently in his dark hair, anchoring herself to him as the room seemed to tilt on its axis. He pulled her tighter by the waist, his fingers digging into her ribs, a silent physical vow of violence against anyone who dared to step between them. Far above them, out on the rainy streets, the faint high wail of police sirens began to bleed through the thick brick walls. The real world was coming. The flashing lights, the crime scene tape, the cleanup crews, the Mafia lieutenants demanding answers and blood. But standing there, wrapped in the arms of a patricide, smelling the drying blood and the spilled wine, Molly's lungs expanded fully for the first time in years. Blood and marinara sauce smell exactly the same when they dry on white linen. Tonight there was no sauce. Only the blood of a dead king seeping permanently into the stone and the violent birth of a new one. Molly wasn't hiding in the corner anymore. She was standing dead center in the wreckage, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the mess. Want more dark, pulse-pounding Mafia romance stories that skip the cliches and go straight for the throat? Hit that like button if Molly's Revenge gave you chills, and share this with your friends who love a gritty, slow-burn thriller. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below. Would you have thrown the picture, or would you have walked away? Let me know, and we'll see you in the next dark chapter.